Non-proliferation and disarmament in the Obama era, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Sigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. Chairing a session of the UN Security Council, a first for a U.S. president, Barack Obama won unanimous approval for an American-sponsored resolution aimed at reinvigorating non-proliferation and disarmament efforts. Later, in Geneva, Iran and 6 world powers met to discuss Iran's nuclear program at a landmark session that included the highest-level Iranian contact with the U.S. in years. Meanwhile, warming relations with Moscow have bolstered hopes for a meaningful bilateral U.S.-Russian arms reduction agreement. And attaching special importance to his disarmament efforts, the Nobel Committee unexpectedly awarded President Obama the 2009 Peace Prize. Have we reached an historical moment in which a nuclear-free world is possible? And is the Obama administration on the right track to take us there? To help us explore the state of the non-proliferation and disarmament movement, we're pleased to be joined in the studio by Jennifer Nordstrom, National Coordinator of the Carbon-Free, Nuclear-Free Campaign for the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. She previously worked with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, focusing on international nuclear weapons policy and law. She also served as the NGO liaison to the UN for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the UN General Assembly's First Committee on Disarmament and International Security. We're also joined by phone by Joseph Cirincione, President of the Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation. He's also author of numerous articles and books on nuclear weapons, including his latest, Bomb Scare: The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. He previously held senior positions with the Center for American Progress and the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. The World Affairs Councils of America have named him one of their Foreign Policy 500, a select group of individuals with the greatest influence on shaping U.S. foreign policy. Welcome both to International Focus.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Joe, I want to start with you and be a little bit of a cynic here and say the Nobel Committee awarded the prize to President Obama in part because of his vision of a nuclear-free world, and we've had that before. I mean, we've had visions before. What gets you excited, if you do get excited, about President Obama's vision?
Well, you know, the Nobel Peace Prize is not a gold watch. It's not given to people at the end of their careers. It's very often given to encourage a cause and to add some momentum to it, and that's what I think they're doing in this case. And a big part of that is his drive for nuclear disarmament. We've had presidents before who have embraced the elimination of nuclear weapons, like John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan. But we've never had a president before who's put forth that vision and then married it up with a series of practical steps at a time when the international environment was so ripe for this kind of change, when the threats have been growing, when there's a widespread recognition that the previous policies have not worked, and where we have partnerships with countries like Russia that allow us to really exercise American leadership in this effort. That's what I think the Nobel Peace Prize was recognizing and encouraging, and it's what encourages me that we have a real chance to fundamentally transform, not just tweak, American nuclear policy, and in so doing change the nuclear policies of the world.
Well, let me see if let me go over some of the reasons why I think, in the media at least, people are discouraged. I mean, it feels like we're going in the wrong direction with North Korea having tested a bomb, with Iran's nuclear program making headlines, stories about loose nukes in the former Soviet Union, Pakistan being destabilized and their nuclear technology. How do you remain encouraged despite these trends?
Well, there's no question that the media likes to portray all these stories in terms of conflict. You know, they want that tension so that you won't flip the page, so that you won't flip the channel. You know, stay here. Thousands could die, and they want the conflict between the liberals and the conservatives. But there actually is a growing bipartisan consensus involving Republicans and Democrats in the military establishments, former foreign officials, former State Department and defense officials, that we need to have a change in our policies. And we've seen Obama implement some of this change, and we start to see progress just in the last few months. So North Korea, it looks like it's going to return to the disarmament talks, come back to those talks involving its neighbors and the United States. It's no longer advancing its nuclear program. Iran, we've had some breakthroughs just in October. We don't know yet whether the promises Iran made will translate into action, but at the very least we've exposed some of their secret nuclear facilities, prevented them from using that as a breakout capability. They may transfer some of their uranium out of the country, so that can't be used as a breakout capability for a bomb. And we've got the possibility of engaging with them and containing that program, if not yet reversing it. And meanwhile, the U.S. and Russia are negotiating a new arms control treaty for the first time in 6 or 7 years that is setting the stage for even deeper reductions. So I see the arrows starting to move in the right direction. The main obstacles, I think, are not actually international. They're domestic politics. It's conservative opponents in the Senate who are trying to derail this agenda as a way of sort of getting at the president. We've got to do all we can to keep this bipartisan and not let these petty politics sacrifice U.S. national security for some domestic political gain.
Is the support within the military? Is that do you see that as one of the most significant changes? In other words, is the military opting for other weapon systems or other types of funding?
Absolutely. And for example, you saw that in the recent decision by Obama to replace the Bush plan to put interceptor missiles in Poland and the Czech Republic with another plan to put those interceptor missiles on ships in the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. And I was there in the White House just a few weeks ago getting the briefing from the senior administration officials and senior Joint Chiefs officials. And it was absolutely clear from the military leaders at that briefing, this was about budgets. This was about money. The Bush plan would have cost $5 billion. The one they're replacing it with is going to cost $2.5 billion over the next 5 years, and it's going to put assets on station quicker against the threat that actually exists. So what you're starting to see is the military actually have a stronger influence in these kind of nuclear policies, these missile defense policies, overtaking the sort of ideological domination of the last few years, and they don't care much for nuclear weapons. They don't think we're ever going to use this, and they want to take these weapons, and they want to take the $54 billion we spend every year, $54 billion on nuclear weapons, and turn it to their conventional needs, the weapons the troops and our allies really need to protect them.
Let me ask you a question that perhaps I should have started with, or maybe sounds a bit naive, but when we talk about a nuclear-free world, what exactly are we talking about? I mean, it's going to be hard to put that genie completely back in the bottle. So what would it look like?
Yeah, and you don't have complete agreement on this. So I'm not saying the military embraces the goal of complete elimination of nuclear weapons. There's a real divide on whether people think that's possible or not. But what there is agreement is that you have to have that as a goal. You know, in part to convince the other countries of the world who don't have nuclear weapons that this is where we're all going, that eventually we're all going to give up nuclear weapons. And where you do get the agreement is on the near-term steps. So you can reduce the number of nuclear weapons. We have, other countries have, negotiated, verifiable reductions. We have 10,000 nuclear weapons. We don't need 10,000 nuclear weapons. Can you cut that down to a few hundred? I think you can, and I think you get military support. I think you get conservative support for that, especially if in the process we're reducing the Russian arsenal, which is the plan, so that they have fewer weapons to threaten us, and we're dealing with China's arsenal and India's arsenal and Pakistan's arsenal. All that makes a lot of sense. Whether you can get to a nuclear-free world, we don't really know yet, but we do know that each step we take towards that goal makes us safer and more secure.
Now, I think we can get to a nuclear-free world. And as a member of the civil society movement that is pushing for a nuclear-free world, I think that alongside these near-term steps, many of which are non-proliferation measures, we also have to talk concretely about what you have just asked, which is what are the steps towards total disarmament. And so we do have to be discussing those things. And I understand that people are very concerned about proliferation, but if you're going to be taken seriously in the international arena in terms of your non-proliferation concerns, you're simultaneously going to have to make concessions on disarmament and be very specific and commit to specific measures to go towards total nuclear disarmament globally. And so if the nuclear weapon states want these concessions in terms of other, non-nuclear weapon states that may or may not want to have nuclear weapons at some point in the future, we do need to be talking about those things now and in a specific way. And a lot of the discussion has been much more vague in general, this vision, this nuclear-free world that could happen at some point in the future. But I would really encourage folks that are in civil society that are concerned about total nuclear disarmament to put pressure for specific steps on nuclear disarmament as well as non-proliferation.
Well, this has often been the objection from states that either have small nuclear arsenals or are aspiring to them, which is, well, that doesn't sound like a deal. You get rid of 9,000, keep 1,000, and I get rid of my 6. I've got none, and you've got 1,000, or you've got several hundred. How do you maybe getting over that last, hurdle is the most difficult, most critical one. So, Joe, how would you advise we do that?
Oh, this is to me. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, first, you've got to build confidence, and this is that this is the direction we're going. And what you've seen is President Obama work with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev to say that we have to exercise leadership. We have to lead by example. And by probably the end of November, early December, they will have concluded an initial treaty to make more reductions in each side's nuclear weapons, establish a new verification system so we can see what each other is doing, and more importantly, lay the groundwork what will be an ambitious treaty to go down to perhaps 1,000 weapons on each side, from the 10,000 we have and the 10,000 they have. You make that kind of serious effort, you get the respect of the rest of the world, you get the confidence in the world, and most importantly, what we have to do next spring is ratify the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. 10 years ago, next week, will mark the anniversary when the Senate refused to ratify this treaty that President Clinton had done, largely for political reasons. It was an impeachment effort on the president. They weren't about to grant him his treaty, that's the way they saw it. President Obama has vowed to bring it back. We've got to show the rest of the world that we're serious about reducing the number of nuclear weapons, reducing the role of nuclear weapons, ratifying the test ban as the single most important step we can take.
Joe, we've got a little less than a minute, and both you and Jennifer mentioned the role of civil society, of voters in making their views known, keeping the pressure on the politicians. What one or two things do you think is most critical for people to know and to do at this point?
Let me start real quick. Let your politicians, let your representatives know what you want. People listen to these kinds of emails and messages and things you might say in town hall meetings. Let them know that you want. Let them know that there's a political reward for doing the right thing. And the second thing is let your local newspapers and media outlets know what you want. This is a democracy. The voice of the people matters.
Great. Joseph Ciancione of the Plowshares Fund, thank you very much for being with us. We'll be right back in just a few moments on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about disarmament and nuclear proliferation with Jennifer Nordstrom. Jennifer, we talked to Joe Ciancione from the Plowshares Fund in the first half of the show, and I wonder if you had some just general thoughts following on that conversation. We can dig in further.
Yeah, I would love to pick up this notion of building confidence. Joe said at the end of the last segment that one of the things that you have to do in order to go from 1,000 to 0 or from 10,000 to 1,000 in the U.S. and Russian cases is to build confidence in the international community, and I think he's right. It's absolutely imperative. When you're talking about going from 1,000 to 0, the people that have nuclear weapons have to believe that they will be safe without their nuclear weapons. Also, when you're talking about non-proliferation, when you're trying to convince other states not to acquire nuclear weapons, they have to believe that it is in their best interest not to acquire nuclear weapons. And part of that is the stick. Part of that is I feel threatened by the international community if I do break out or acquire these nuclear weapons. But part of it is also the carrot. I have to feel as though I will be safe without these nuclear weapons. And that is conflict prevention. That is peacekeeping. You know, that is making sure that the way that we resolve our disputes in the international community is not through the threat or use of force. And that is key to getting from 1,000 to 0. And when, you know, partially we're based on law in the international community, but a lot we're also based on the threat or use of force. And you have to figure out how to increase the rule of law among nation states in order for those nation states to feel that they do not need the ultimate destructive power in order to defend themselves.
It sounds like what you're describing is that a sort of fundamental change in the kind of deterrence mindset, which was states v. states, and it was really confined to that realm. If you balanced out the ability to destroy each other. Now that we've seen a growth in the number of nuclear power states, my casual observation, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, is that people are making a much different assessment, which is I have some vague fear of force being used against me, and so I'm going to kind of grasp for this nuclear capacity as this ambiguous sort of defense curtain. That feels like a much more unstable world. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, mathematically speaking, the more nuclear weapons holders you have, the more likely one of these is to go off at some point. It's just a game of numbers. But I think that what you just said, we need to be aware of the fact that it's not necessarily a vague threat. North Korea and Iran, for instance, are not feeling a vague threat. You know, they were specifically targeted in the axis of evil with nuclear weapons. So that's not vague. It's pretty clear. And when you have that sort of threat, calculus, you know, your threat calculus says, well, maybe I need one of these nuclear weapons. I am an advocate for total nuclear disarmament, so I don't think anyone should acquire nuclear weapons. I'm just saying that when you're thinking strategically, you have to think not just as the United States, you have to think as many other countries do. And when the United States has superior conventional forces to every other country in the world combined, and spends more on its conventional forces than every other country in the world combined, you have to understand that that's where some of these calculations are coming from small nations that feel threatened by the United States or other large powers that think, how can I fend off these drones or these huge bombs that I have nothing, you know, I have no way to defend myself against? Well, they think that nuclear weapons are a pretty good defense for them, so maybe they're a good defense for me. And so when you're doing strategic calculations like that, and you're thinking about how to go from 10,000 to 1,000 while maintaining the number of non-nuclear weapon states at the number that it is now, you have to consider that people make the same threat calculations that you do.
Right. I want to give you a quiz about the different types of threats we might be facing in this realm. So one is maybe the more traditional one, which is we have large stockpiles, United States, Soviet Union, and it's reducing those down or limiting them to some smaller number, maybe by a factor of 10 or 20, we reduce those. So that's one set of problems. Another problem would be just proliferation, the numbers game you were referring to earlier, the number of states that have this capability. And then the third is one we haven't really talked much about, which is just the sort of suitcase bomb, the potential for nuclear material to be used in a terrorist attack. Which of those do you see as the biggest threat at this point?
Oh my. I mean, for me, the existence of nuclear weapons creates all three of those threats. And so I choose to go after the source and talk about total nuclear disarmament. I wouldn't prioritize them because I think that they all come from the existence of this particular type of threat that could kill millions of people in an instant. And that doing different calculations in terms of which one is most likely to go off first, some people make their living doing that, and I understand that. As an organizer, as somebody who wants to, change structures, I'm looking at the source, which is the fact that we use the threat or use of violence to resolve disputes, and the fact that as human beings we've created this incredibly destructive force that could not only wipe out millions of people in an instant, but could simultaneously end the world as we know it. And that, in combination with the fact that we use violence or the threat of violence to resolve our disputes, is a very scary scenario. Whether it's in a suitcase dispute resolution or whether it's in a total global nuclear war resolution, it's still pretty bad. Albert Einstein said that, everything changed with the invention of the atomic bomb except human nature.
Mm-hmm. As sort of an organizer and someone who's been working on these issues and working with civil society organizations, with official entities like the United Nations, where do you start? I mean, like you were saying, this is an issue just fundamentally about how force is used in the world, the size of militaries, both those that are nuclear capable and those that are not, and maybe are using small arms and more easily available weapons. Where do you start in that huge array of problems?
Well, I started at the international level because that's where I saw the negotiations happening. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is an international treaty, and that governs what different nation states can and cannot do in terms of nuclear weapons. But I've gradually moved into a more local framework of understanding, and working at the international level during the Bush administration, I came to see the United States as one of the major impediments to moving forward in terms of disarmament and non-proliferation. I think things will change during the Obama administration, but the reason I'm working at the more local level in the United States specifically is because they will only change as much as the people call for change. Right now, what we're seeing is a lot of anti-nuclear rhetoric, this vision of a nuclear weapons-free world, which I share wholeheartedly, but that kind of huge institutional movement from a nuclear weapons-based dominance to a nuclear-free world will require a lot more pressure from voters and from citizens than just administration trying to implement a program.
Well, some have said to me that the reaction they get at the grassroots level is people saying, "Oh, the Cold War's over. Aren't we done with that? I mean, aren't we done with the nuclear drills and all those sort of scares?" And do you find an apathy on the part of the public toward nuclear weapons?
Most people are in that camp. They think that the Cold War is over, especially people my age and younger. They didn't grow up with a lot of the scares. The 80s are either a very distant memory or not a memory at all. But when you start talking about the fact that the threat still exists and that there are still this many nuclear weapons and they're still on hair trigger alert, and Iran and North Korea people hear about all the time, obviously, but they don't necessarily recognize that the United States has nuclear weapons, which obviously we have thousands. So people generally are in favor. I mean, there are opinion polls that show that Americans are in favor of total global disarmament as long as we don't do it on our own. They're interested in it. But it's not their priority. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say apathy, I would say it's just much lower on the list of things that people are concerned about than, the economy and the war in Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's important to frame it in terms of, well, we're spending, $54 billion a year, we're committing all of these resources and this time and this energy into something that's actually making us less safe instead of safer, and what would happen if we moved that money elsewhere, but also thinking about how we would change the way that the world relates to one another and thinking in a new strategic framework. And I find that young people get very excited when they start thinking about, geopolitics.
Let me put the question to you I put to Joe Srincione. We've only got a minute and a half or so left. So what's your advice to those folks? How can they educate themselves? How can they take action and make their voice known?
I think the first things Joe mentioned were absolutely right on. Contact your senators and representatives. The first thing that'll come up is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and of course we want that to be ratified, but that's just step one. It's not, you know, the end game. I think it's important for people to note that they want the role of nuclear weapons in the United States military framework to be diminished, and that's really key. It's not just numbers, but it's how we rely on them and how we think about nuclear weapons and what their use is. So saying that they're not useful at all would be helpful. Getting into your local newspaper, but also organizing. Getting together with a group of people and taking an action. It doesn't matter what the action is, because what you're doing is you're creating a group of people that come back together on a regular basis, and that is powerful.
Jennifer Nordstrom, thank you very much for your insights on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Is there a website people can go to?
www.carbonfreenuclearfree.org.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jennifer. To our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,